It's a little past 10, so I think we'll get started. Good morning. I'm Judy Russell, the Dean of University Libraries here at the University of Florida. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event, a discussion of the book Citizen Mack, Politics and Honorable Calling by Connie Mack III. He served as a member of the United States House of Representatives from Florida from 1983 to 1989, and then as a senator from 1989 to 2001. As a politician, a crusader against cancer, and a dedicated father and grandfather, he has had many titles throughout his life and career, but his title of choice remains citizen. This book is Senator Mack's memoir of an 18-year journey to and from Capitol Hill. Excuse me. We're grateful to have Senator Mack's papers here in the Smathers Libraries at the University of Florida, and proud to acknowledge him as a graduate of the university. Interviewing Senator Mack today will be Carl Van Ness, university historian and Florida political papers archivist for the Smathers Libraries. Jim Cusick, curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History, will monitor the questions submitted in advance and throughout the interview and share them with Senator Mack and Carl Van Ness at the end of the program. You should see an option to submit questions using the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. That has been disabled for this event, and the audience will be muted and their videos turned off. Welcome again, and let me turn you over to Carl Van Ness, who will introduce Senator Mack and begin their discussion.
Thank you, Dean Russell. Connie, let me say it's a privilege and a pleasure to be talking to you today, and I really regret that we can't do this in person. As Dean Russell stated, we're here primarily to discuss your book, but there are going to be opportunities to talk about things that are not in your book. Your story is a fascinating one, and I really enjoyed reading your book. It's amazingly detailed and filled with both trivia, such as your shoe size, which, if people are curious, it's a size 14.
It was a 14.
It was a 14, it's now, okay. As well as some incredibly significant historical information. We will, of course, focus on the important stuff and not on your shoe size. But
right.
Let's get the biographical details out of the way. You were born in Philadelphia, but you moved with your family to Fort Myers when you were 10 years old. You attended Fort Myers High School and later attended the University of Florida, class of '66. Go Gators. Before entering politics, you were an officer in a community bank in Cape Coral. You and your wife, Priscilla, raised 2 children. They produced 6 grandchildren, and you now have 2 great grandkids.
Yes.
You served 8.
I said yes.
Okay, good. You served 18 years in Congress, 6 in the House and 12 in the Senate. You retired in 2000 at the height of your popularity with higher office beckoning. And since leaving office, you have dedicated much of your life and time to the fight against cancer. And we're going to return to some of those items later. But first, though, for those who are unfamiliar with the Mack saga, briefly tell us about the Connie Mack name and those who bore it and currently bear it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Carl. First, let me just say, I want to thank you and Judy and Jim and Misty and Matt Cruz for all of the support that you've given me over the years and the work that we've done together with respect to my papers being at the university. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you.
Pleasure for us.
The name Connie Mack, unknown by most, is a short name. My full name is Cornelius McGillicuddy. And that was the name of my grandfather, who became very famous as a baseball man. He was one of 3 men that created the American League in 1900 and owned and managed the Philadelphia Athletics for over 50 years. And so very famous. So to just kind of skip forward, there is a Connie Mack or Cornelius McGillicuddy V, my grandson, and we refer to him as Cinco. It's a little easier with all the with all the Connies in the family. We refer to him as Cinco. Connie Mack Jr., my father, probably was an inspiration for my community work. I learned that from him. So one of the lessons I learned early on, Arthur Finkelstein said to me at the beginning of my campaign in '82, Connie, the name might help you be listened to one time. If you don't have anything important to say, they're never going to listen to you again. So get over it and move on with your campaign.
Oh, good. So Connie's one of those gender ambiguous names. Would the family ever approve of a female Connie Mack?
Very interesting question. I have actually met several women over the years whose name was Connie.
Sure. And
one in particular was Connie Mack, whatever her maiden name was.
Oh.
And they were named after my grandfather. Their father wanted a boy, and decided to name their daughter Connie Mack. And so while that's not happened in the family, it certainly, I think, sets the stage. Certainly someday, I wouldn't be surprised if someone's daughter in the family wasn't named Connie Mack.
Okay, thank you. Since the publication of your book, a lot has happened in the nation and in DC, culminating in the events of January 6th, which, to quote FDR, it'll be a day that will live in infamy. Tell us, if you will, your thoughts on what has transpired and what is transpiring in the nation.
Yeah, there's no question that there has been an enormous amount of activity since the election in November. It's kind of hard to say, do I start with the election? Do I start with the inauguration? Do I start with the attack? Do I start with the impeachment? I mean, so anyway, I think where I will start with just to say the inauguration. I think it was an important inauguration. They all are, but this one in particular, I think. I believe that most people who observed it found it to be uplifting and reassuring. With the conflict that took place on June 6th, the old question, or what we would say and take for granted every 4 years, that peaceful transition of government from one party to the next really meant something. So it was an important inauguration. President Biden's appeal for unity, I think, is something that's shared by all of us, but I think is going to be very, very difficult to bring about, and we'll see whether that in fact can work. I would like to have used the word civility. Maybe if we concentrated on civility first, and maybe then out of that would come unity. So let's move to the January 6th. It just so happens one of those rare moments where Priscilla and I were both at home. We sat down to have lunch. I said to Pris, why don't we just turn the TV on, see what's going on the Senate floor? Because I knew that this discussion about questioning the electoral college votes was going to be coming up. Sure enough, Mitch McConnell was speaking at the time I turned it on. And we watched the events unfold during the day. At first, it didn't really seem to me that there was anything that was other than maybe a rally that was going to take place. And next thing you know, we saw this mob storm the Capitol. So again, from a personal perspective, the feelings that I had was, driven almost like having lost a dear one. I mean, I was so stunned and shocked by what I saw. And this is a place where I had worked for 18 years. The Capitol to me is a symbol to the world of the importance of democracy. Many of us refer to it as the citadel of freedom. And so I guess the last emotion that I guess I felt was one of despair. And a phrase kept going through my mind. You remember the old song, The Day the Music Died?
Yeah.
To me, that kept playing in my mind. I hope 50 years from now that historians don't look back and say on January the 6th, 2021 was the day the music died, or the notion of the importance of democracy. After going through all of that, I mean, I'm not in a story on your level, Carl, but I've been engaged in a pursuit of reading a biography of every president of the United States, and you get a great insight in American history by doing that. And it was very clear. We've gone through times of violence. We've had riots, and most of us, we can remember 67, 68, the riots that took place in the country, the assassination of John Kennedy. I was on the floor of the House when a man who was had wired himself with enough explosives to kill half of us on the floor. Fortunately, the device didn't detonate. Well, so my point in all of that is that we'll get through this. We don't know exactly how this is all going to play out. We'll have a better idea as we look at the elections as they move into 2022. So I guess the last thing I would say about that, anyone that was involved in the breaking into the Capitol of the United States ought to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Yeah. With respect to the elections themselves, I think I might give a little bit different perspective than most. Because there was more to the election than just Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but that's where our focus has been, and that's rightfully so. First thing I would say is that it was a rejection of the person, Donald Trump. If it were a rejection of his policies overall, you wouldn't have seen the Republicans picking up seats in the House. I think somewhere around 10. There's 28 Republican governors in the country. State legislatures, Republicans picked up seats. My point there is the Republicans lost the presidential election, but they pretty much won everything else. And so that really does set the stage, though, for a continuation of this divided government and divided people. And lastly, with respect to the impeachment, I am really disappointed that the decision was made to pursue impeachment. I think there are serious constitutional questions as to whether you can impeach someone who no longer holds an office, but that's for the Congress to work out. So those are my thoughts generally about kind of what we've gone through. I continue to be optimistic. Democracy is a complicating, divisive at times process, but there's nothing better that I'm aware of, and free people will make the right decision given the time to do it.
Well, let's go back to some happier times in 1982. Tell us, how were you called into public service? What were your thoughts leading into your decision to run and to go into politics?
Well, that's a question we probably could spend the next hour covering. But it's important, I think, for voters to, and I think it's important for individuals who run for office to be as clear about what their motivations for running are. You'll hear people a lot of times that say, "Well, I'm running because I want to give back." Every time I hear that, I kind of to me, it's kind of a throwaway line that says, I really don't know why I'm running, but, that's a good answer to the question. In my case, a lot of different things came together at the same time. I'm not an individual. I didn't go to college with the notion that I needed to prepare myself to be in politics. I had one political science course at the University of Florida. So my life just eventually led me there. I mean, I had a grandfather and a step-grandfather who were United States senators from the state of Texas during the FDR time. Mm-hmm. I was significantly influenced by John F. Kennedy. Of that generation when Kennedy was shot. I mean, it's just something that is still very much a part of who I am. Listening to his challenge, it's not what your country can do for you. It's not what you can. Well, what the quote is. I sound like Joe Biden now, and some which reminds me, that is, I am 80 years old, so these kinds of things will happen. But Kennedy was an inspiration to me. Obviously, Ronald Reagan was a huge inspiration to me. I started out, like many people, thinking about Ronald Reagan as the either as an actor or as a cowboy. And how could one of those possibly ever be president of the United States, to where Ronald Reagan is, my political hero? So that was an inspiration. What Congress was doing in affecting and involving itself in legislation with respect to banking. I would go home at night and I'd say to Priscilla, you know what they've done now? They're now going to require the banks to be the policemen of the Flood Insurance Act. And that, it would be almost weekly that I would come home and complain. And Priscilla finally looked at me and said, Connie, if you're going to complain about something, why don't you go do something about it, or shut up? And so that was kind of a lead in. Then the loss of my brother, Michael, probably had the greatest personal influence. Michael was a student at the University of Florida at the law school there. He and Dennis both went to the University of Florida Law School. Dennis graduated #2 in his class with honors. Michael had to come behind him a year later, graduating #1 in his class with honors. And he did that while he fought his way through a radical neck surgery with respect to cancer. He survived that and lived another 12 years fighting that cancer, deeply engaged with Dennis and myself. And we really got into some real deep discussions about the meaning and purpose of life. And I finally realized, and there was one conversation I had with a Reverend Don Shank, and he was one of those individuals who was always pointing out the good aspects of an individual. And he kept telling me this and that about myself, and I finally looked at him and I said, Don, what I hear you saying is that the biggest sin a person can commit is the failure to use the talents that God has given you. And I had no longer said that. I knew exactly what I was going to do. As I'm driving home to tell Priscilla, tears are coming down. I was filled with fear. I hated to give speeches. And here I am getting ready to embark on a political career. Got home and I said to Pris, what would you say if I told you I was going to run for Congress? And she said, great, go for it. And I've thought since then, what if she had said, I don't really think you should do that? What would have happened? But anyway, I've condensed a lot of stuff into, there are a lot of motivations there. And the bottom line is that I learned somewhere, and I think it was Zig Ziglar that I heard it from, is that success is really helping other people to succeed in their lives. And so those were the motivations.
Well, you were a novice politician in 1982, and you had to learn a lot on the fly. You just mentioned your stage fright. You learned a lot of early lessons about debating and speech preparation. Relate some of the lessons that you learned.
Sure. Because there were a lot of interesting aspects of that. So I'll name two. One is the debate, first debate, in essence, that took place in the 1982 campaign, and then the first and most important debate that took place in the 1988 campaign. So 1982, this is in the primary. There were 5 of us in the primary. We were at a table in front of the TV cameras, typical lunch table, portable lunch table type thing. 5 of us, if the person on one end moved, the person on the other end felt it. That's how close we were packed in next to each other. The cameras in front of us, and over to our right, up on a stage, were 3 reporters asking questions. It was the most convoluted and strange environment. Anyway, so I think I was in the middle of the group, and so when it came my time, a question was posed to me. Maybe it was just even an introductory, tell us who you are kind of thing. And as that question was being asked, a door opened to the right, and the person walked right through the room, in front of the cameras and in front of the, I just lost it. I was looking. I must have looked into the TV camera for what seemed like a lifetime, with that kind of like look on your face. And that's when my new press secretary said to my wife, does he really want to win this race? He's going to have to do something different. And I'll tie these two together. So in 1988, and maybe make one other comment. You'll hear people really debate the issue. Are debates important? And a lot of times people just kind of blow it off and say, they're not important. It's just one little aspect your campaign. I would say, from my experience, that debates are extremely important, and so the debate that took place in 1988, if I remember correctly, I was behind in the polls, our internal polls. I don't know about the extra. Our internal polls showed me down about 8 points, fairly significant. And the poll that we took after the debate showed me up by 4 points, which was a huge swing. And so maybe 1/3, I don't. It's hard for people, I'm sure, to remember. A debate took place between Al Gore and Jack Kemp in St. Petersburg it was 1996, and Jack Kemp answered the first question, and after that, it was like, I don't know what else to say. And the point there was, he did not take preparation seriously. And so in my campaign in '88, as opposed to the one in the debate in '82, we spent 3 solid days preparing for that debate. I mean, we set up a room that would look exactly like the room in which we would be holding the debate, podiums, TV cameras. We had hired someone to play the role of Buddy McKay, my opponent. We had many of my staff acted as people who were asking questions. And Arthur Finkelstein, who was my political consultant, was there observing the whole thing. And so a question would be asked, and so we videotaped these, and we had 3 different debates, as I recall, and each time the person substituting for Buddy McKay would act differently. On one of the campaigns, he was one of the debates, he was very aggressive. And another time he was, very, very, he really was not aggressive at all. So it was to try to get me to see and to understand and feel how different it can be depending on how the opponent approaches it. It was a dreadful experience. I mean, it was a grueling 3 days. I mean, I was worn out by the time I got to the stage. Even thinking to the point, maybe we had spent too much time doing that. But it turned out, that's the key there. Preparation, preparation, preparation. If you're going to be a candidate, you're going to be in a debate, you need to prepare for that debate. And for me, it really did make the difference.
Well, Connie, if you ever want to relive your experiences, we have the videotapes that you made in your collection, and they are. I looked at one of them, and they're fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's move on to political philosophy. Throughout your political career, your positions and views have been guided by a underlying political philosophy, which you describe in your book as follows: freedom is the core of all human progress. Tell us how that translates into specific public policy, whether it's domestically in areas such as the budget or tax policies, or internationally.
Yeah, so let me add to that, Carl. I mean, yes, there's no question. Over and over again in my speeches and in the book, I refer to this line that is, freedom is the core of all human progress. It's part of other views as well. If the tagline of our campaign in '88 was less taxing, less spending, less government, and more freedom. So the interesting thing is that there were many times when a new issue would come up before the Senate, when I'd be sitting around with staff and we'd kind of working through, where do we come down on this particular issue? What are the things that drive it? What are for it? What is against it? And many, many, many times we would ask the question, well, what does it do from a taxing standpoint? What does it do from a spending standpoint? What does it do from the growth of government standpoint? What's the impact on individual freedom? So that's kind of a little bit larger overview. But the way it played out, to be specific, is that there was an issue that came up fairly early in my Senate career, people may remember it as being 2 Live Crew.
Mm-hmm.
The position I took on it really surprised people, because it's clear that different individuals in both parties were taking positions that people couldn't quite figure out why they were doing what they were doing. But in my case, I saw 2 Live Crew. Let's see, I have to try to set the stage here. 2 Live Crew was. Do you have any info on?
Oh, yeah,
Live
yeah,
Crew?
sure. For those people who don't remember, it's one of the early hip hop groups, and they were noted for their, kind of raunchy and misogynistic lyrics. Their first album was called As Nasty as They Want to Be, and it was declared obscene in the state of Florida, and you could not buy it legally. I mean, people were actually arrested for selling the album. And then in 1990, the band was arrested, or at least certain members of the band were arrested in Broward County for violating the state's profanity laws. Yeah. So that's the kind of backup. But like you said, a number of people on both sides of the aisles took different opinion, took different stances.
Exactly. And Navarra, Sheriff Navarra, I think was his name, in Broward County, was the one Republican sheriff who arrested 2 Live Crew. As most politicians, your staff will prepare for you each day clippings from around the state and around the country about political things that are going on. So I'm, just going through page after page, and this story about the arrest hits me, and I thought to myself, that's just wrong. There is a thing in this country called freedom of speech. There are times when we hate that notion, freedom of speech, but it's the essence of a democracy, freedom of speech. And so I said to Mitch Bainwald, my chief of staff, and Arthur Finkelstein, all 3 of us reacted to that article exactly the same. And I think Arthur was a little bit surprised that I would be willing to step out and say that I thought that they should not have been arrested, that it was wrong. We need to commit ourselves to the freedom of speech. So that's one. Again, and what was interesting is that the press response, one of the stories that I remember anyways, oh, Mack seems to believe in freedom, And of course, I'm saying to myself, of course I do, but in politics, your motives are always being questioned. But so that's an example on the domestic side that I would use. In a foreign policy, one example would be the state of Israel. And in the discussions about Israel, and when you listen to the leaders of Israel, they always said that their focus is on security. Well, security and freedom was exactly the same thing. And so I believe that that our policies with respect to Israel was to help them defend their freedom, to keep their security. I might take just a second to expand on this notion of freedom in foreign policy issue. There was an issue in the 1980s in Nicaragua, the Contras, and President Reagan gave his last nationwide speech on Nicaragua, probably in, I don't know, late 80s. My timing may be a little off there. And in his speech, he mentioned the word freedom 20 or 30 times. Lee Hamilton, who was the Democrat who responded to Reagan, never used the word freedom once in his response to what Reagan said. And I'm sitting there, I'm listening to this thing, and it just like a bulb goes off. That's the fundamental difference, at least as it was then, between the right and the left. The left's commitment to freedom, to peace, and the right committed to freedom. That's not to say that somebody on the left doesn't believe in freedom or somebody on the right doesn't believe in peace, but there are times when you have to make a choice. And there was a book written by Václav Havel, the president of the Czech Republic. after they threw off communism. And the title of the book is Disturbing the Peace. And what the point there was, there may be peace in a country, but there's no freedom. And there are times when we just have to break through that. And so I know I spent many hours trying to convince Priscilla, or to make her understand what was going on in my mind, this difference between. And so I would say, well, yes, there's peace in Czechoslovakia today, but there's no freedom. Or there's peace in Poland today, but no freedom. And there's peace in Cuba today, but there's no freedom. And so freedom became for me the kind of the centerpiece of my foreign policy.
Well, let's jump to the year 2000 and your decision to get out of politics and revert to being a common citizen back. So first, tell us why you made that decision.
Well, it seems like with many decisions, it develops over time. I think that probably the most important point in the beginning of that decision was in 1996 when Senator Dole had me on a short list, for vice presidential to run with him in 1996, and I was kind of surprised at all that. I mean, I'd see these, so and so's on the short list, so and so's on the short list, and here's my name, and I'm saying, yeah, sure. So week after week goes by, and the list gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and finally it got down to what I understood it anyway. It was a choice that was going to be made between myself and Jack Kemp, and of course Kemp was a dear friend of mine, and the decision. Dole called me and said, "Now listen, I need to know from you, and I'll give you some time to think about it. But I really need to know from you. If I call you and say I want you to run, I need to know before I make the call whether you're willing to accept it or not." So that gave me a lot of time to think about it, and I was scared to death, to tell you the truth, about the notion about running nationwide and running as a vice presidential candidate. But in the end, I made the decision that if he asked me, I would do it. So I went through that, and to me, it was a very, very thoughtful process, checking every box, if you will, and probably most important, an understanding of really who you are and where you want to go in your life. I said, okay, I'm willing to do it. And interesting choice of words, willing to do it. But Dole picked Jack Kemp, and I was delighted. And I called Jack and congratulated him and said, "Good luck." Anyway, so what happened from 96 to 2000 is that after going through that thought process and then not being chosen, really made me ask the question about where am I really going now with this political career? And the conclusion was, when this term is over with in 2000, I'm not going to run for re-election. It's just time to move on. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I had just made the decision that my political career was over and it was time to go do something else. And it was that simple.
And you went public with that, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Fairly, I wanted to announce that I wasn't going to run for re-election because the last thing I wanted to have is my party to say to me, "Oh, you didn't give us enough time to find someone else to run." And so I think we probably made the announcement a good 18 months, maybe 2 years, almost 2 years prior to the election in 2000.
Okay, so you've made this public statement to get out of politics before 2000, but then in 2000, you get a call from Dick Cheney. Go ahead and tell us what transpired over the next month or two.
Well, the reason
after that call,
it's a very interesting story. In fact, here in my den, I have a picture of myself and George W. There's 3 of them with my wife, and the pictures tell the story that I'm about to tell. Anyway, so Dick Cheney and I've known him for a long time. We introduced the Grand Rudman Deficit Reduction Bill in the House back in '85 together. And so I've known him a long time. And so I get this call from Dick, and I, of course, had read in the papers that George W. had picked him to head up the vice presidential candidate to the list of people who he might consider. And so I get this call from Dick, and he just wants to tell me that the governor is interested in putting you on the list. It's okay if I put you on the list. And I said, no, Dick, I don't want you to put me on the list. I'm really not interested in it. And, you know, it was, I don't remember exactly what he said, but, you know, it was kind of like, well, okay. Because he was at the beginning of the process. And then I got a call from Jeb. And Jeb says, you know, Connie, my brother really wants you to run. You know, you vetted with Dole. You're not going to have to go through all that again. And I said, Jeb, you know, it's just, you know, I've made the decision to leave politics. And so I really don't want to do it. And I really kind of thought after that call that was the end of it. And so Chris and I, fast forward, this probably would have been in late June. We had just driven down from Washington, moving into a place that we had rented before our house was we had under construction before it was complete. And the phone rings, and it's Dick Cheney. And I remember kind of doing, you know, one of these, you know, and looking over at Priscilla and saying, "It's Cheney." And be careful. And so Dick says to me, Connie, look at the governor really wants you on the ticket. I mean, I said, Dick, let me be very clear. I don't want to do it. And he says, damn, I'll have to find some other son of a bitch to do it. Well, of course, it turned out it was himself that Dick ended up, and even that was not the last little exchange. George W. was down in Orlando, and I've forgotten the date of it. And you know, for one of those big political fundraisers, and so Chris and I were, you know, went up to the event. We're in line like everybody else to have their picture taken with the future president. And Chris says to me, now, you know, he's going to ask you. I mean, he's going to ask you. And I probably said, oh, he's not going to do that. I mean, we've already crossed that bridge. Sure enough, we get up there, and he's kind of famous for how he puts his hands on people's shoulders and looks them right in the eye. And he says, Connie, I want you to be my running mate, or something like that. And I said to the president, or to the governor, I said, I don't want to do it. And he turns to Pris and says, can't you talk him into doing it? And she said, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And so he looked back at me and said, damn, you're a tough guy, or something like that. And then with the three of us turned around, looked at the camera, we had these pictures taken. But that's what happened, and that's how it played out. I finally called President Bush, sometime mid last year. When the book was coming out, I was thinking to myself, gee, I hope, I had this feeling that maybe he thought I was rejecting him, and not from a personal perspective, didn't want to do it. And so I cleared that up with him in a conversation, and he was very understanding, and he knew that was exactly the case.
Well, thank you. As we all know, the election of Florida was decided by 537 votes. And Jeb Bush later remarked that had you been his brother's vice president, he would have won Florida by more than 537 votes. Now, he's probably right, but I want to engage in some hypothetical history here, because you were not the only Floridian being considered as a running mate in 2000. Bob Graham was also in the short list for Al Gore, but we all know that Al Gore went with Joe Lieberman. So I'm going to pose you two hypothetical questions. You can answer them as briefly or as long as you want. Hypothetical one, in a contest between Gore-Graham versus Bush-Cheney, who do you think wins the election in 2000?
So what was the second one going to be?
No, this is the first hypothetical question.
No,
it's Gore-Graham versus Bush-Cheney. Who wins that election?
Well, with a 500 and some odd votes, you got to think that Bob would have, could have certainly maybe turned the tide, and won that election. But again, like you say, this is a hypothetical. The assumption is that nothing else changes as a result of the different. There's an assumption there that in this particular case, that that Bob Graham would have done a better job than Lieberman did in the debate with Cheney. Who knows? There are a lot of things that could happen, but I think on the surface, the question really begs the point that if Bob had been on the ticket, certainly he would have been worth 537 votes, and maybe Gore would have won.
Okay, so hypothetical two: Gore Graham versus Bush Mack.
Oh, there's no hesitation in answering that one.
Okay.
Bush Mack.
Okay.
But this gives me an opportunity to because I don't know that we'll have another opportunity to do this. The relationship that Bob Graham and I had in the Senate, I think, is an important one to note. Now, it was a really tough and mean-spirited end to the 1988 campaign. There were things said that, in retrospect, people would probably say, I wish I hadn't said that. After I was elected, I thought it was incumbent on me, because I was the new guy on the block, to go sit down with Senator Graham, Bob Graham, and have a conversation about the importance of our working together. And he was totally open to it. And we spent a lot of time talking about that. Our staffs believed in the notion that two senators from the same state but in different parties can work together. And I think it's fair to say that if we had not worked together, we probably would never have been able to pass the legislation saving the Everglades in 2000. Bob and I have a different view of the world from a political standpoint, but we work together very well, and our staffs work together very well. And again, I think it's an example of, yes, there can be bipartisanship, if you will, and you just have to work at it. And again, I just great admiration for Bob Graham, and it was a wonderful experience working with him. And I think Florida was better off as a result of that relationship.
Well, the longest chapter in your book doesn't deal with politics. It deals with your fight against cancer. Tell us about that campaign. What were your motivations for getting into the campaign after you left office? Your work with the Moffitt Center at the University of South Florida, and where you think we are today in the fight against cancer?
Well, I mean, we have made enormous strides, and maybe I'll get back to that in a minute. But just my whole involvement in the fight against cancer came because of my brother Michael's death of cancer. Again, diagnosed with melanoma when he was, I think, 23 years old. Died when he was 35. Just a wonderful, wonderful human being. Deeply touched me, and so. Interestingly, like every other family, and almost every other family in America, Priscilla had breast cancer. I was diagnosed with melanoma, had to deal with the same cancer that killed Michael. My brother Dennis was diagnosed with melanoma. My sister Susan was diagnosed with melanoma. So, it was just rampant. So that's where it kind of began. And so let me back up for a moment. One of the things that I did after the 1988 election, and I'm talking about within the first week after the election, is that I sat down with, again, Arthur Finkelstein, who was my political consultant, with Mitch Bainwall, I think maybe Mark Mills, who was my press secretary. And we talked about, Arthur kind of said to me, Connie, look, if you've got a 6-year term now, it's not a 2-year term, it's a 6-year term. So you can focus on some things that are not strictly political. And so is there anything that motivates you? And I said, yeah, clearly cancer, the fight against cancer. And so, we as a group said, that's a great idea. And and again, another bit of advice from Arthur was, look, you can't just show up in Washington on January the 3rd and say, I'm here to save the world from cancer. all these different organizations have been involved in the cancer fight are going to kind of say, who is this guy? He's only here for political purposes or whatever. He said, you got to earn your way into this in this fight. So we put together a whole series of different things. One of the things what I would do when I would come home on the weekends or when we had a week off from the Senate, every day or every trip would have me visiting a research center, a hospital that focused on cancer, to learn what was going on, and engage things with the American Cancer Society, and the National Cancer Institute, and so forth. So I made myself really, pretty knowledgeable about what was going on in the fight. I picked up a book just by happenstance called Transformed Cell, which was written by Steven Rosenberg, who's the world's leading, I'm going to say immunotherapist. I'm not sure if that's the right title, but he was convinced that we could train the immune system to defeat melanoma. That was his focus. So, I read that book and it was like somebody sat down and wrote me a letter and said, this is what you ought to do. And I went out and met with Steven Rosenberg, and we've become dear friends over the years. And so when I left the Senate, one of the things that I did was I proposed the doubling of the National Institutes of Health. The taking it at those days was about $13 billion to $26 billion. And I'm not sure where the number is today, but that was a big commitment. Most people think it couldn't be done, and we ended up doing it. So I'm getting ready to leave the Senate. Lee Moffitt, who was a former Speaker of the Florida Legislative House, a Democrat, contacted me and said, next time you're in the area, let's us talk. And I sat down and had a nice, wonderful dinner with Lee. Have great admiration for Lee. This is a man whose passion is just unbelievable. His commitment, and he single-handedly created the momentum behind the creation of what's now known as the Moffitt Cancer Center. And he asked me if I would be interested in working with him, and I said sure. So conversation went on, and then I stepped down from the Senate. I get a call from Lee, and he said, we meaning Ted Couch, who was the chairman of the board at that time, and he had been talking. They'd really like for me to join the board and wanted me to, and he said, I know you're the kind of person, if you're going to be involved in something, you want to really be active in it. And so we would like for you to be the chairman of the board. And I accepted, and I chaired the board at the Moffitt Cancer Center for 8 years, and still engaged with it. Just one other point here. I remember a conversation that I had we had just hired a new center director, and I said his name Bill Dalton, and I said to Bill, there's really only one thing I want to talk to you tonight about, and that is I want Moffitt to become a premier melanoma research and treatment center in the country and maybe even the world. And he said, that's interesting, because that's what I wanted to talk to you about as well. Florida is a natural place to do that because of sun and clearly the sun can cause melanoma. So again, I went back to Steven Rosenberg and I asked him, give me some names of people that I ought to try to get to come to Moffitt Cancer Center to create this new program. And he gave me some names, and we came away. Jim Ulay is an incredible leader in the world of immunology. Jim Vern Sondak. We had a fellow by the name of Jeff Weber. Jeff has left us now, but we now just recently hired Patrick Dr. Hu, who's an outstanding, world recognized, probably has written more papers about immunotherapy and melanoma, and he's now leading the Moffitt Cancer Center. So I said in the book, and there was a fellow by the name of Don Adam who I asked Don, that's another whole long story, but I asked Don for $20 million to help get this program started, in which he committed to. In fact, without Don, we never would have been able to put this together. But, and I told Don, because of what he did, there are people living today who clearly would have died from melanoma if he and we had not done what we've done there. I mean, when a person got a diagnosis of melanoma 10 years ago, a stage 4 melanoma, there was 2%, 3% chance you might survive. Today, that number is 50% or greater. And we're going to keep pushing it up even more. So it's been a long journey. There's a lot more to do, but we've accomplished great things, and we've got great things on the in the planning at Moffitt today.
Well, Connie, our hour is wrapping up here, so I'm going to open it up to the chat line and see what our audience has for us. So, Jim, if you're out there.
Yes, I'm here, Carl.
Okay, chime in and let us know if there are any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Senator.
Sure,
we've
Jim.
had some questions coming in during your discussion, and people are submitting questions in both the question and answer box and the chat box. So I'm going to monitor both of those. People can certainly feel free to submit questions. This is one I think you've already touched on, but it's a good question, and I think it's worth revisiting. Someone has asked, Senator, what words of advice would you give to people who are contemplating a political career today?
Well, a lot of thoughts going through my mind. If someone were to ask me, I would say something like my wife said to me, great, go for it. What usually comes, that question usually comes up, people have this kind of sense, who in the world would run for office, given what's going on today? And I would say that the motivation to look for is, does the person believe in and love this country? I mean, that was the motivation, one of the motivations for me. I love this country. I love what we've done. Sure, we've made mistakes, but it's a great country. It's a great democracy. And I would encourage anyone who's thinking about it, whether they're Democrat or Republican, go for it. But spend time thinking about why you're really doing it and what you want to accomplish. And one of the things that you ought to be thinking of when you say the things you want to accomplish, you're doing it in service for others. And with that kind of motivation and love of country, go for it.
All right, thank you. A question's come in from your fellow Senator, Bill Nelson. And he asked, would you talk a little bit about how your faith is important to you?
Well, Bill, first of all, thank you for participating, and thank you for that question. I just might start out by responding. Bill and Grace Nelson have done a great deal over the years to encourage people in politics, not just in Florida, not just in our country, but throughout the world, to be engaged in their own spiritual journey. So, Bill, thank you. The question opens up a whole lengthy discussion. As you know, I spoke to the National Prayer Breakfast years ago, and it was one of the most meaningful moments of my life. It has led me to be engaged with the prayer breakfast in the Senate, which takes place every Wednesday morning, in which you were very active during your times in the Senate. It led me to reach out to world leaders in Haiti, for example, to talk to them about the importance of following the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. It affected the way I lived my life in Washington, D.C. and in the Capitol. I remember there was an occasion where Senator Byrd severely chastised me publicly on the floor of the United States Senate, and didn't charge me with breaking the rules of the Senate, but got close. And the natural instinct was to be defensive, say, oh, I never said that, or I didn't mean that, or I didn't. And I truly believe it's because of my pursuit of my faith that I went to the floor of the Senate and apologized and told them that I was sorry for having said what I did, and that I came to the floor out of love, not out of hate. And so that's how. I mean, there's so much more I could go into on that question, but thank you for raising it. It's been an important part of my life, and I continue to speak to groups of both in and in our in our state and also around the country. So thanks, Bill. I hope you and Grace are doing well.
All right, here's a question that's come in that I think is on a lot of people's minds. It is, do you see the Republican Party changing significantly following the presidency of Donald Trump, or do you think the party will proceed much as it did before?
No, well, let's see how to. I don't see the party changing a lot from where it has developed over these past 4 years. And the reason I say that is because, again, Republicans were pretty successful in races throughout the states, in the legislatures, in governorships, and in the House itself. So I think that there's a strong commitment to the policies that were developed and proposed during the last 4 years, and I think that they're going to get strong support within the party. The real struggle is going to be really what is the role of Donald Trump going forward? Is he going to run for re-election, or is he going to not run for re-election but be engaged in party politics? He can raise, as you know, enormous amounts of money and support various candidates. So that part of it is kind of up in the air. I don't know exactly what is going to happen there, but I'll pick an example. I remember one of the things when Donald Trump first started campaigning, and this whole thing about free trade. I'm someone who believes strongly in free trade, but the way his campaign was perceived, anyway, was one of, this guy is a protectionist. I would just point to the modifications made to NAFTA as an example that he was not a protectionist. He just wanted the rules to be more favorable to the United States than what they were at the time. And as a result, he got agreements with both Mexico and with Canada. And we have a continuation, if you will, of the NAFTA trade agreement. So I think the party is probably policy-wise is well positioned, but I just don't know how the Donald Trump person influence in the party is going to play out.
Here's a follow-up, actually, very close to that question, which someone has asked, do you think America can ever return to a period of bipartisanship, or will we remain divided as red states versus blue states for the foreseeable future?
Okay, well, I know this is going to be disappointing, but the answer is we are going to continue to be divided. And when I say continued, we've been divided since the day the country, since 1776. The first few elections, there was a hope that there would be no parties, but parties developed very quickly to American politics. And those two parties have been opposing each other for all these years. As I mentioned earlier in my comments, I've read a biography of almost all presidents of the United States, and there's not a lot of bipartisanship evidence during that period of time. Agreements were reached, compromises were reached, and things moved on. But there are two major philosophies that are in conflict, and that's not going to change, I don't believe. And I'm just on a personal note, I think I mentioned also at the beginning of the show that I had a step grandfather by the name of Tom Connolly, who was a senator from the state of Texas, who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee from 1941 with slight interruption until 1952. There's this notion of bipartisanship came as a result of a approach that he took in getting Vandenberg to agree to how they were going to move forward some decisions on foreign policy. That lasted as long as World War II lasted. As we moved our way into the Korean War, that notion of foreign policy being bipartisan just disappeared. I mean, it's just, it might come and go, but no, we're going to remain divided in our philosophical view of the world.
Jim, we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
All right, well, this is another good follow-up one because it says, Senator, you said you were reading biographies of each president. Besides Ronald Reagan, who was your favorite president and why?
Well, good question. And I think I have never been a fan of FDR. I just got through reading his biography by Gene Edward Smith. Fantastic. So I came away from that reading of FDR almost with awe of the man. An incredible president of the United States, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether you agree with all his policy or not. I mean, it was an amazing president of the United States. I think you've got to put in that mix Ulysses S. Grant. Again, I would encourage people to read about Grant. An amazing individual who accomplished a great deal, both in his military and his presidential life. I'm sure I could walk through Jackson. Jackson was a president that had enormous influence on American politics, and was one of those individuals that was not well liked. That's a huge understatement. The official Washington despised Andrew Jackson, but he had a major impact. And of course, our founders. You've got to go with Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and so forth. But those are the names that pop out in my mind. And if I didn't mention Teddy Roosevelt, I certainly should have. If you're looking for a surprise read, see, I never should have done this, and now the name has disappeared. Garfield, James Garfield, very short, was assassinated, but a very interesting individual.
Okay, Jim, one more question.
All right, well, this one actually goes back more to the personal side. But early on, we heard about your grandfather and father. Someone's asked, how did your mother's side of the family influence you?
Well, I mean, greatly. Let's just go with Mom. A couple little things pop into my mind. Mother would always say to me, never end a sentence with a preposition. Very hard thing to do, but that would seem to be one of the rules that was important to her. But the other thing, and the most important thing, is that her interest in Shakespeare. Her father wrote a book on Shakespeare, my grandfather, the senator, on Shakespeare. And Mother sent me this note after I won the election in '82, a quote from Julius Caesar, which goes something like, "There's a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune." And I don't remember the full quote, but in essence, made the point about, if you don't take a risk, or if you miss an opportunity, that's your fault, and so be willing to take risks. So that would be one thing from my mother's side. My grandfather, Morris Shepherd, the senator from Texas, he wrote the 18th Amendment and believed in prohibition from, till the day he died. Big mistake. And so we always kind of look back at that one in the family, and well, I won't go any further into that, but I think the notion of public service came from their knowledge and their experience. As a young man, I had a chance. I was 7 years old. Two quick incidences. One was the 1948 Democratic National Convention, was held in Philadelphia. I was 7 years old. Tom Conley, my step-grandfather, senator from Texas, was still in the Senate, invited us to one of these typical convention luncheons with hundreds of people. I'm sitting next to him with all these Democrats in this room, 7 years old, and I hop up and I start screaming, "I'm a Republican, I'm a Republican." He looked and said, "You see that radio over there? If you don't sit down and be quiet, I'm calling the police and have you taken out of here." So that had an influence on me. But I saw him give speeches on the floor of the Senate when I was 7 years old. And I'm sure somewhere in the back of my mind, this notion, well, maybe I could be a senator someday.
And you were.
And I was.
Well, Connie, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation this morning, and I wish we had more time. But before I turn it over to Dean Russell, just want to give you a few more minutes to, any final thoughts, any corrections you want to make, any amendments?
If I could remember what I said, maybe I could make the corrections. No, this is a wonderful opportunity, and again, I thank you folks at the library for putting this together, and it was a great opportunity to reflect on some things. But it was I just appreciate it so much. It was very enjoyable from my perspective as well.
Okay, Dean Russell, will you take us out of here?
I would be very happy and honored to do that. And first, let me say how much I've enjoyed this, and thank you, Connie, for your service. I think you're very right that we need people with the kind of heart and the kind of commitment to make the choice to go into politics. So I'm grateful for your stories and for your service. But I do want to thank you and the other participants for a wonderful program, and all of you who attended. I'm delighted that you were able to be with us. And if you have already purchased or plan to purchase Senator Mack's book, you can request an autographed book plate. Senator Mack will autograph each book plate, and we will send it to you if you've signed up to receive one. You'll also receive a commemorative digital gift booklet. If you're interested in supporting the Connie Mack 3 political papers, please contact the development office. The contact information will be on the back cover of that booklet. Contributions are used to support the preservation, digitization, processing, storage, accessibility, and promotion of Connie's political papers, as well as future programs like this. And we also want to thank today's co-sponsors, the Bob Graham Center for Public Service and Oak Hammock at the University of Florida, a life plan retirement community here in Gainesville. Thank you again for joining the Senator and the libraries for this event. Be safe and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.